Welcome back to Overview of Six Sigma and Organizational Goals. In this topic, topic 2, we'll be discussing lean principles. So lean is a continuous process that is designed to eliminate or reduce non-value added activities and waste from a process. And we do it by increasing continuous flow in the process and minimizing stop flow and unbalanced production. Now, before applying Six Sigma to any process, it is important to check the waste status of the process and to eliminate or to reduce waste and non-value added activities. Every Six Sigma project will have some element of lean, but not every lean project will have an element of Six Sigma. Lean is all about reducing speed or improving efficiency within the process. Six Sigma is about reducing variation and improving effectiveness within the process. So it's always helpful to apply lean strategies to your Six Sigma project before you go and reduce variation, because the last thing that we want to do is make variation faster. So here's a great example of lean concepts. So this following example shows how lean can be applied to a process to reduce waste. So here we have a problem. A welding technician observes that sometimes he has to work with rusty components. Well, the traditional way that we would do that is that we would use an oil coating followed by a cleansing process to prevent problems during welding. That would be our traditional solution. If we apply lean to this solution, one of the ways that we could solve it would be to identify how to reduce inventory to minimize the wait time for the steel components and ensure rusting does not occur. So to kind of break this down, in a traditional solution, we would have a ton of steel components laying around. We would coat those steel components with oil, followed by a cleaning process so that the welder could successfully weld the two pieces together. But the question you have to ask is, why do we have all of these steel components around? By reducing that inventory reduces the amount of steel components that could rust to begin with. So lean focuses on the following 3 major issues within any process. The first one is waste, which is muda. Then you have overburden, which is the Japanese word for muri. And then you have an unevenness, which is the Japanese word for mura. When we talk about muda, we're talking about waste. And today there are 7 types of waste that have been identified. It begins with overproduction. Now, overproduction is simple. It's just producing more than what the customer is requiring. So if the customer wanted 10 of a product and you produce 12, the extra 2 would be overproduction. Now, inventory is also referred to as stock. So for instance, in an inventory environment, anything that's extra that you're not currently using is considered waste. Then we have defects. And a defect is any product or service deemed unusable or unsuitable to the customer. Then we have motion. Motion is just waste that's generated due to poor workplace and then we have motion. Motion is any waste generated due to poor workplace ergonomics. It's basically the movement of people. How many steps you walk to get from point A to point B. How many keystrokes you press on your keyboard. Then there's overprocessing. Overprocessing is just making the product or service better than what the customer requirements are. It takes extra resource, extra money, and extra time to do something that the customer never wanted to begin with. Then there's waiting. This is where parts or people are waiting for the next step in the process. And then finally, transportation. This is the actual movement of machinery or product from point A to point B. A great example would be in a warehouse, where a forklift would physically transport inventory from the warehouse to the production facility. Now, there are other areas of waste within lean that we can talk about. The big one is underutilized skills, and this is getting more and more popular all the time. In fact, I would argue that there really isn't 7 wastes, but 8. Now with underutilized skills, these are where we're not using the skills within the workplace. We're not assigning the right people to the right task. Others would argue of underperforming processes, such as the automation of a poorly performing process or improving a process that should actually be eliminated. And then finally, some asymmetry in the process that should be eliminated as well. Now here are some examples of a few types of waste. Let's look at inventory. Now materials are air freighted into a company for the materials requirement planning deadline, and the deadline is on the first day of the month. The material then sits there in the warehouse for 3 weeks before it's even used. That 3 weeks of space within the warehouse and the 3 weeks of time that the inventory is sitting there is considered waste. So let's look at defects or rejects. Here's an example. Payments from the customer are not received on time because the customer claims that the information on the bill or the invoice and the order do not match. It's a defect. How about overprocessing? Well, let's say an inspector rejects a blemished part that's observed under a microscope when the specification allows for blemishes not visible from 3 feet away. So let's look at overproduction. This is where we would be producing more than what the customer requires. So there are 5 steps in the process of lean implementation. It begins by identifying value. We always identify the value from the customer's perspective. Then we have value stream mapping. This is where we'll actually perform value stream mapping to identify both value added and non-value added steps. Then we'll create our flow, and we'll make the value stream flow better. Then we'll establish pull, and we'll let the customer pull products whenever the customer needs them. And then finally, perfection. We're always seeking perfection. That's the reason why it's called continuous improvement. To implement a successful lean process, it is important to identify what the customer wants and understand what the process should have to do to meet the customer requirements. Value stream mapping is the visualization of mapping the path of value by identifying all activities that are considered value added and non-value added. Now, any process can be classified into 3 distinct categories: value add, non-value add, or value enabling. To be value added, an activity within the process has to fulfill 3 criteria. First, it has to be able to move the product or service through to completion, which means it has to be part of the flow. The second one is that the customer has to be willing to pay for that step. Now, they don't necessarily have to pay dollars or money for that step, but they have to really care about that step because that step helps to produce their product. And then the third one is that it has to be done right the first time. So we can't count a feedback or a rework loop. So to be non-value added, it has to violate one of those 3 criteria. So it could be done right the first time, and it could move the product through to completion. But if the customer doesn't really care about that step, or they're not willing to pay for that step, we have to consider it non-value added. Another example would be, let's say that we do have that process step that moves that product or service through to completion, and the customer is willing to pay for it, but we can never do that step right. We're always reworking it. If that's the case, it's still non-value added. Now the third one, which is kind of gray, is something called value enabling. Now a value enabling step is absolutely non-value added. The customer is not willing to pay for it, and it may or may not move the product through to completion. A great example of a value enabling step is auditing. Auditing is one of these things where we're always double checking our work. So why do we have to double check our work if the work is supposed to be done right the first time? Well, in some instances, government agencies or the customer or even the company itself may require us to double check or audit our work. Well, this particular step isn't value added, but it is necessary for the customer to receive their product or service. Because it's necessary and we're unable to eliminate this step, we consider it value enabling. But in the end, the customer is not willing to pay for this step, but has to in order to receive the product.